All right. The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, my suspicion is that most everybody has seen or heard some variation on this. It's a poem by Robert Frost. Two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, perhaps it's because I'm old and bitter, but I am so cynical that when somebody tries to use this genuinely, like most of the time I just want to like jump up and shout at them, like, boo! Again, maybe it's just me, but I think most of you know what I'm talking about, right? It's normally like the valedictorian at a high school graduation who's driven there in their fancy sports car that their parents have bought for them. They haven't ever had to have a job, and they get up and they make some puffed up speech about how hard high school has been. But we all made it through together, and now the world is our oyster, and everything we want is ours for the taking. Then I mentioned that I'm old, bitter, and cynical. My favorites are when they include a Dr. Seuss quote. Oh, the places you'll go. It makes me nauseous. But then a lot of times, they end up with this quote. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled, and that has made all of the difference. Boo. So thankfully for my cynicism, my very brief looking into this poem on the super trustworthy internet, this poem doesn't seem to have a connection to the Sermon on the Mount or this passage in particular. So that was good to find. But it does seem that what Jesus is doing here is trying to make a similar point. There are two roads to choose from. Well, one is a wide and a smooth road. It's inviting and easy. It leads to a large gate that allows anyone through. This is the path of least resistance. But Jesus says it. This is the road that leads to destruction. There's another path, though. It's the road less traveled, if you will. Thankfully, nobody booed me there. It's less obvious, right? Jesus says it must be found. Those who find it are few. It's a rough road. It's a road that requires more work to walk. It leads to a narrow gate. If you're thinking about like a city being defended, right, a narrower gate is one that's easier to police. It's one that's easier to guard, to make sure that only the people who are supposed to be going through that gate are going through. This is the path that leads to life. What's interesting to me is that Jesus is not speaking in riddles here. He's not telling a parable that he'll need to explain to his disciples after the crowd has left. He's not speaking cryptically about his true identity and asking the disciples to keep it silent until the right time. He's not using bizarre or outlandish language to describe the end of the world. Jesus did do all of those things, but not here. The meaning here is plain and easy to understand. You must choose a way to go. There's an easy and an inviting path that accepts everyone. But this is the way that leads to destruction. However, for those who find it, there is the path of discipleship, the path of following intensely after Jesus, following sincerely, authentically after Jesus. This way is more work. It requires intentionality, discipline, repentance, seeking. But when you arrive at that gate and you hear those words, well done, good and faithful servant. This is the way to life. The meaning here is plain. But the way that we work this out is not. So having some knowledge of how to put a sermon together, some knowledge of ancient rhetoric will, I think, be helpful here for understanding what's going on. So let's take a moment and look at part of this ancient rhetoric, right? So one of the common things that was happening in the ancient world is that they would use this this imagery of two roads that you could choose to go on, two paths that you could choose to be on, to represent different things. This was a very common rhetorical device that Jesus might have been using. And so this is something that like his hearers would have been familiar with. Now, the meaning is still plain to us, but this is not an image that is used as frequently because we don't walk anywhere. We don't walk everywhere anymore. We have cars, and so the idea of there being a rougher path and an easier path, one that's wide and one that's narrow. These are not they're not as clear images to us, but these would have been quite clear, quite understandable to the people of the time. This was quite common imagery. In fact, in the epistles of Barnabas and in the Didache, which are early Christian writings, we see that this imagery gets picked up and used over and over again to describe discipleship, sort of following in Jesus' footsteps here. Another thing that Jesus is doing here is that he's putting in a memorable quotation. I know that it's really difficult to believe, but Jesus was a much better preacher than I am. So where I don't always do a good job of this, like my memorable quotes or the thing that I'm trying to accomplish in the sermon, like normally that doesn't land. But Jesus was really good at this, right? And so this image is really clear. It's super memorable, right? Like what is Jesus talking about here? Oh yeah, he's talking about the two paths, and you need to choose one, and one is harder and one is easier, but the outcome of one is better, and the outcome of one is worse. Jesus was really good at this. In fact, he's so good at this that like a lot of these have worked their way into our like common everyday expressions. So like Luke 14:11, for example, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Another version of this is the first will be last and the last will be first, right? Like everybody's heard of this. It's super clear what's going on, and you can remember it. Another example, John 14:1, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. Like Jesus is bringing the disciples up to this point of he's ready to go to the cross, and in this one moment he's summing up the whole of his ministry. He's explaining to the disciples what's about to happen in one memorable phrase. Perhaps the most obvious, though, or one of the most quoted, is actually often attributed to Abraham Lincoln, but in fact, he was quoting Jesus. Matthew 12:25. Jesus is doing some activity where he's interacting with demons, and he's actually accused of working on behalf of the demons. And Jesus says to the Pharisees who've made the accusation, no city or house divided against itself will stand. Right? And so everybody has heard the Abraham Lincoln quote, a house divided cannot stand, or a house divided will fall. He's actually quoting Jesus in that moment. So Jesus was really good at taking these sort of complicated ideas, all of the points of his sermon that he wants to get across, and distilling them into one memorable quotation. And that's what he's doing here. But looking at the structure of the sermon, I think, is also instructive. Looking at where we're at in the sermon is also helpful. And so it's interesting to note that we're right at the end of the sermon. Jesus has not got a lot left to say. He's entering his conclusion. And in fact, he's going to do a little bit of repetition with this passage. He's going to make the same sort of point a couple of times through his conclusion. So I'm going to let you guys have a little peek behind the curtain here for just a minute. Like, application for sermons is where you put that at the end, because that's the part that I want you to remember. That it's the part that I want you to remember because it's the life change that I'm after, right? Like pastors don't get up and preach every Sunday because we like preaching, though we do, or because it's easy and fun, though it can be fun. It's not easy. But the thing that we're really after is the life change, the behavior change, the spiritual growth and maturity that comes from the Word of God. And so we put the application part at the end because that's where it makes the most sense. And so that's what Jesus is doing here, right? So he's summarizing the Sermon on the Mount that he's done up until this point. He's putting it all into a memorable quotation, and then he's asking us to apply it to our lives. And this is what I mean by the meaning is easy to understand, but working it out is difficult. This is the application section of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is communicating in a way that doesn't leave us with any excuses. Jesus is calling us to the more difficult road, to the path of discipleship. The problem is we don't live in the first century anymore. The world around us is very different from the world that Jesus inhabited. It's difficult enough to apply modern sermons. It's difficult enough to apply the Bible to our own lives. Spiritual growth, spiritual maturity is hard, difficult work. And it doesn't help that we live some 2,000 years after Jesus did. We live in a different world. It's not so obvious anymore how we should apply the Sermon on the Mount to our real lives. So let's work back through the sermon. We'll hit some of the highlights, and we'll see what Jesus has in mind for us as disciples, as those on the road less traveled. So we'll begin with the Beatitudes. Jesus is introducing his sermon, and he's starting with some sort of introductory ideas of what it means to be a disciple. Blessed are the poor in the spirit. Blessed are those who are mourning. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Those who are merciful, pure in heart. The peacemakers and the persecuted. Now, obviously, I don't have time to go through all of those, right? We've been doing this sermon series for like 4 months, so I don't imagine y'all want to be here until next May. But we can hit some of the highlights, right? We'll focus in on a few. So one of the ones that stuck out to me was meekness. What is meekness? It's not really clear, right? This is not like a word that we use in our contemporary vernacular. This is not a word that we're using consistently in our language. And so, like, what does it mean to be meek, right? Like, sometimes this conjures up images of weakness, perhaps. Meek and weak, they kind of sound similar. Or maybe timidity. Maybe you've heard somebody give timid as a sort of example of meekness. But I looked it up in Merriam-Webster, and Merriam-Webster offers enduring injury with patience and without resentment. Another dictionary offered not being impressed with one's own self-importance. It's the idea here not of weakness, but of controlled strength. It's the idea of enduring injury, standing under persecution, standing against those who are doing you harm, with patience and without resentment, not returning injury to those who have harmed you. Jesus goes on to talk about those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. This struck me as a really odd turn of phrase. Like maybe we need to stand up for righteousness or something like this, but what does it mean to hunger and thirst for righteousness? And I think the imagery here is important, right? This is the idea of taking in food and drink. Just as our bodies need food and water to live on, to be energized by, so also blessed are the people who hunger and thirst for righteousness, who are energized by standing up for what is right. But Jesus goes on from there. Matthew 5:10-12, he says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So one thing that has not changed for us from the first century, from Jesus' context to now, is that the path of discipleship is the harder path. This imagery of the two paths still holds true. The path of discipleship is the narrow and more difficult path. Our context is one that's full of corruption. It's full of sin. It's full of temptations to take the easier path. And yet Christ calls us to meekness. He calls us to hunger and thirst for righteousness. He calls us to persecution and to stand with meekness, to stand patiently and without resentment against persecution. And in fact, it's not hard to envision a time when these three particular Beatitudes may be called of us. Historically, these three have been called of the church. The church has stood historically under persecution. And these three attributes, meekness, hunger and thirst for righteousness, standing under persecution have been called upon. It may not be right now, but it's not difficult to foresee a day when we, as the church in the United States, may be called upon to stand under persecution, to stand with meekness and righteousness, to stand up for what is right and not return injury on those who are persecuting us. This is the more difficult path. The path of discipleship is more difficult. It would be easier to turn and to return to the easy path, the smooth and the wide road that leads to the wide gate. But that's not what Jesus has called us to. He's called us to meekness, to righteousness, and to stand under persecution. He goes on from here to talk about our being salt and light in the world. Remember when I said Jesus was way better at preaching than I am, and he's really good at putting these images together? I wish I could come up with that. Like salt and light, that's perfect, right? Salt is this valuable thing in the ancient world. It's the thing that we cook with, and it makes our food taste better. It's a thing that we use to preserve meats. Like salt was this incredibly valuable thing in the ancient world. And so was light. I think we take light for granted a little bit, right? Like we can walk over to the light switch and we flip it on and the lights come on. And they're really not that expensive to run. And if one of the light bulbs go out, we just go to the store and get one. But imagine if there were no light bulbs. Like everything in the world becomes more difficult. Like sitting in a building like this with only 2 windows on the sides, like that's not possible anymore. This becomes a dark room. Like we take light for granted. But not in the first century. They didn't take light for granted in the first century. This was the cycle that kept up their work days. And so what is Jesus calling us to here as salt and light? He's calling us to enrich the world. We're to openly better the world for the glorification of Christ's kingdom. We know that persecution is coming, and we're to enrich the world. We know that sinfulness is right outside of our door, and we are to enrich the world. We know that there's a wide and an easy path that we could take, and yet we are to enrich the world. Jesus moves on from this image of salt and light to a series of prohibitions. He's specifically talking, it seems, to the Pharisees and their interpretation of the law. And I find that the prohibitions, there's a couple that are extremely relevant to our current time. We find ourselves in a time of tribalism, where information siloing, social media, these different mechanisms have separated us from one another, such that we only hear the things that we want to hear. And we find ourselves getting angry about the people who disagree with us. It leads us to a hatred of our enemies. But that's not what Jesus calls us to. Jesus prohibits anger. He says, do not be angry, but be reconciled to one another. Those who are accused of anger against their brother are subject to judgment. I think what's also particularly appropriate here is the beatitude of peacemaking. Blessed are the peacemakers. Those who go about engaging with other people, making peace, not being angry, but making peace. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand. Our time is one of division, and these divisions are not unimportant. There are important divisions, but we can still engage with one another with peacemaking, not with anger. We can engage with one another with civility and not with malice. In fact, Jesus calls us specifically to this. He calls us to love our enemy. He calls us to love those who we disagree with. He doesn't say that the disagreements are unimportant or are unimportant. He still calls them enemies. We're to love our enemies. They are our enemies. Make no mistake, the disagreements may be important, and there are true enemies of us in the world, and yet still we are called to love them. He says, you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. I think there's a story in the Bible that sort of excellently captures this idea of loving your enemy. And that's the Israelites as they are sent into exile. Specifically Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are taken from their home in Israel and they are taken to the king's palace. And in the king's palace, they're asked to eat from the king's food and to drink the king's drink and to learn from the king's educators so that they can become advisors to the king. But Daniel doesn't want to defile himself with the drink of the king, with the food of the king. And so he asks for the person who's in charge of them to allow him and his friends to just drink water and to eat vegetables. And the servant agrees. And they do better. They do better than the other people who are brought there because they are following after God. And yet, what they're doing is they're loving their enemies. You see, Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they go on to become advisors to the king. In fact, prominent officials in the government. They're loving their enemies. They're wishing well upon those who are their enemies. The king did not wish them well. He took them from their home. And as long as they were away from Israel, then the king and his people were still enemies. And yet, nonetheless, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego still loved their enemies. But they didn't let their love for their enemy overrule their obedience. You see, at some point, the king makes a decree that he is the only one who should be worshipped. Now, of course, this goes explicitly against what is allowed for by the scriptures. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're not going to follow this commandment. And so what happens is the king's other advisors, find out that they are not following this decree of worshiping the king. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the fiery pit. Now God saves them, but they didn't know that was going to happen. They had faith that was going to happen. They thought it might, but they didn't know that it was going to happen. Their obedience was important. It overruled their desire to do well by their enemy. Daniel does the same thing. He's unwilling to pray to the golden idol that the king sets up, and he's caught praying to the Lord, and he's put into the lion's den. Again, he didn't know that he would be rescued. He had faith. I think he has a good idea that this is going to happen, but he doesn't know that he's going to be rescued. His obedience trumps the difficulty of his life. His obedience trumps the difficulty of following the difficult path, of loving his enemies. And this obedience is what Jesus turns to in his Sermon on the Mount. You see, we live in a world that's full of money. In fact, we live in a world that worships money. And it's difficult sometimes to know how to interact with people who worship money. These are the types of people who their life goal only is to be wealthy. What do you want to do in your life? I want to make millions of dollars. I want to be wealthy. What is the purpose of your life? To make money. That's a worship of money. Now, I don't want you to mishear me. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with wealth or money. It's the worship of money that becomes the problem. It's when your life goal, your life becomes centered around money. When the purpose of your life is to increase your wealth, that is when money becomes a problem. And so Jesus gives us some commands, some things we need to be obedient to in order to fulfill this life on the narrow road. He calls us to generosity. Christ calls us to care for the needy. In fact, God has always called his people to care for the needy. He's always called his people to care for the poor, the sick, the orphan, the widows. God has always called his people to care for those who cannot care for themselves. He also teaches us not to lay up treasures for ourselves here on earth, but to lay up treasures in heaven. You see, Jesus teaches us about the fleeting nature of wealth. Wealth is fleeting. Even if all of your wealth lasts for the whole of your lifetime, you don't get to take it with you. In the same way that your life is fleeting, so also wealth is fleeting. Jesus says, you cannot serve God and money. Now, I want to reiterate, having wealth is not bad. But the worship of money is. When making money begins to take priority over your spiritual health, over your following after Jesus, I think it's time to take a serious look at whether you're on the narrow path. So this is the narrow path. It's the cost of discipleship. It's the road less traveled. It's full of hardship and work. It's full of temptation to return to the easy road. But that road leads to destruction. Only the narrow path, the path of discipleship after Christ, leads to the kingdom of heaven. Remember when I talked about the skill of Jesus distilling down teaching into these memorable moments, these memorable phrases? Luke has another one of these that I'd like to point out. It's Luke 14:28, where he says, "For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it?" So I don't want you to be deceived. I want you to first count the cost. The path is narrow. The way is hard. You'll be called upon to stand up for righteousness. You'll be called upon to stand with meekness in persecution. You'll be called upon to respond to the world, not with anger, but with love for your enemies. You'll be called upon to be peacemakers, even with those who disagree with and mock you. You'll be called upon to give financially for the care of others and for the care of the church. You'll be called upon to give generously in your pursuit of Christ. You'll be called upon to stand for Christ, to exemplify Christ in a world that hates him. Luke 14:27, "Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." This is the cost of discipleship, to bear a cross and follow after Jesus. This is the narrow path. And before you embark, I want you to consider the cost, because the cost is high. But it's the only path that leads to life. It's the only path that leads to the narrow gate. It's the only path that leads to the kingdom of heaven. It's the only path that leads to those sought after words. Well done, good and faithful servant. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. Let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. You have heard it said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. You have heard it said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who's in heaven. Do not lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven. Or do not lay up for yourself treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. This is the Sermon on the Mount. It's the narrow road, the difficult path, the path that leads to life, to salvation, to the kingdom of heaven. But before you embark on that path, make sure that you consider the cost. Let's pray.